Smile for the cameras, Evelyn, my sister-in-law Victoria whispered as I stepped into the Lancaster Foundation gala. After tonight, you won't matter to this family anymore. I smiled back like her words meant nothing, even though something cold settled deep in my chest the moment I heard them. The ballroom at the Whitmore Grand Hotel glittered like old money and polished arrogance. Crystal chandeliers reflected against marble floors so clean they looked wet beneath the soft golden lights. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd carrying champagne flutes and tiny lobster pastries while a string quartet played near the stage where the Lancaster family logo glowed in silver against black velvet curtains. Every important person in Chicago seemed to be there that night. Politicians. Investors. Charity board members. Women wrapped in designer gowns worth more than my first car. Men shaking hands with smiles that never quite reached their eyes. And right in the center of it all stood the Lancaster family pretending they had built their empire alone. My late husband Theodore's portrait hung beside the stage, larger than life, his familiar gray eyes staring over the room like a ghost nobody wanted to acknowledge anymore. He had been dead for 14 months, and somehow his family had already rewritten history. According to them, Theodore Lancaster built the company himself. According to them, I was simply the aging widow who still attended events because she couldn't let go of the past. I handed my coat to the attendant and walked toward the main ballroom entrance, feeling dozens of eyes slide toward me before quickly looking away. People still recognized me. They just no longer knew whether they were allowed to speak to me. Victoria stood near the champagne tower wearing a silver gown that shimmered under the lights like armor. At 42, she had mastered the art of looking elegant while making other women feel invisible. Beside her stood my stepson Graham with his usual polished smile, one hand casually resting in his pocket as if the entire evening belonged to him already. "Evelyn," he said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Your invitation sounded so sincere," I replied softly. Victoria's lips curved slightly. "Well, family is family." The way she said it made the word feel like an insult. A young hostess approached carrying seating cards on a silver tray. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said nervously, handing me mine. I glanced down at the card and felt the room go strangely quiet around me. Printed beneath my name were the words, "Courtesy guest. Not board member. Not founder's wife. Not family. Courtesy guest." Like I had wandered in from the street and someone was too polite to throw me out. I heard a small laugh nearby. Then another. Victoria lifted her champagne glass slowly. "Oh dear," she said with fake concern. There must have been some misunderstanding with the printers. But the satisfaction in her eyes told me there had been no mistake at all. Graham avoided looking directly at me. That hurt more than the card itself. I remembered teaching him how to tie his first necktie before prom. I remembered sitting beside his hospital bed when he broke his arm skiing at 16. Now he stood there pretending humiliation was simply part of the evening entertainment. I could have left right then. Any reasonable woman probably would have. Instead, I smiled lightly and slipped the card into my clutch. "No misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I understand perfectly." Victoria looked almost disappointed by my reaction. She had expected tears. Anger. Maybe a scene dramatic enough to entertain the donors standing nearby. What she got instead was silence. And silence unsettles cruel people more than outrage ever does. Across the ballroom, I noticed Harold Bennett near the stage speaking quietly with two board members. The moment his eyes met mine, his expression shifted. Not pity. Not embarrassment. Respect. Real respect. He gave me the smallest nod before looking away again. That was when I realized something important. Not everyone in that ballroom believed the story the Lancasters were selling. And not everyone had forgotten whose signature still sat hidden inside the company's original controlling shareholder agreement. The orchestra began playing something soft and expensive sounding as more guests filtered into the ballroom, their voices blending into a low hum beneath the crystal chandeliers. I moved slowly through the crowd, smiling politely whenever someone looked at me long enough to force acknowledgement. Most of them avoided eye contact altogether. That was the thing about wealthy families in Chicago. They never humiliated you loudly if they could accomplish the same thing with silence. A waiter offered me champagne. I took a glass mostly to keep my hands occupied. Across the room, Victoria had already gathered her audience around her. She laughed too loudly at every conversation, touching arms lightly, leaning close when influential men spoke to her. She had spent years learning how to become exactly the kind of woman the Lancaster family admired. Beautiful. Charming. Ruthless underneath. Theodore used to say she reminded him of polished ice. Pretty until you slipped on it. I caught sight of my reflection in one of the mirrored walls near the ballroom entrance. At 67, I no longer looked like the woman who used to stand beside Theodore during magazine interviews and charity auctions. My blonde hair had faded into soft silver, and the lines around my eyes had deepened over the years. But I still carried myself the way Theodore taught me to. Straight shoulders. Calm expression. Never let them see what hurts you. Especially not people who are hoping for it. Mrs. Whitmore. I turned to find Harold Bennett approaching me carefully through the crowd. At 74, Harold still carried the quiet confidence of a man who understood power better than most politicians did. He had served on Lancaster Biotech's board since before Graham was born. Theodore trusted him completely. "Harold," I said warmly. "You clean up well." A faint smile crossed his face. "I could say the same to you." His eyes briefly flicked toward Victoria before lowering his voice. "I was sorry to see the seating card." "Were you?" I asked softly. "Or were you surprised they finally stopped pretending?" Harold let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Your husband warned me this family would become dangerous once money mattered more to them than loyalty." Hearing Theodore mentioned so casually after so long tightened something inside my chest. There were days I still expected him to walk through our front door carrying the Wall Street Journal under one arm, asking why the house smelled like coffee at midnight because he knew I could never sleep after board meetings. 14 months later, grief still arrived in strange ways. Sometimes through silence. Sometimes through memory. Sometimes through watching people erase the life you built together as if you had never belonged there at all. Harold studied me carefully. "You should know there are rumors tonight. There are always rumors at Lancaster events. Not like this." He lowered his voice further. "They are planning to announce the merger before midnight." I stared at him for a moment without reacting. So that was it. The gala was not just another charity performance for Chicago society pages. Graham and Victoria planned to finalize the merger Theodore had spent years refusing. A merger that would hand controlling influence of Lancaster Biotech to a private equity group out of New York. Theodore used to call those firms corporate graveyards. They bought companies, stripped them apart, then sold the bones. "I see," I said quietly. Harold looked almost uneasy now. "I assumed they had already spoken to you." I nearly smiled at that. Spoken to me. As if anyone in the Lancaster family had wanted my opinion since Theodore's funeral reception ended. Victoria suddenly appeared beside us, perfectly timed, holding another champagne flute she clearly did not need. "Harold," she said brightly. "There you are. Senator Reynolds has been asking for you." Then she looked directly at me with that same polished smile. "Evelyn, darling, your table is toward the back tonight." We had to prioritize current leadership and major investors closer to the stage. Current leadership. The words landed exactly the way she intended. I nodded lightly. "Of course." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying me with visible disappointment again. She kept waiting for me to break. What she did not understand was that women like me learned long ago that surviving humiliation quietly was sometimes the most dangerous thing we could do. Dinner service began shortly after 8 o'clock, and the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as guests moved toward their assigned tables. The soft sound of silverware and low conversation filled the room while servers placed plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables in front of Chicago's wealthiest families. I followed the hostess toward the back section, exactly where Victoria had intended to place me. Far from the stage. Far from the cameras. Far from relevance. My table sat beside a massive arrangement of white orchids near the service doors where waiters disappeared in and out carrying trays. I recognized only two people seated there. One was an elderly donor named Margaret Ellis who smiled at me kindly before lowering her eyes with obvious discomfort. The other was a junior executive from Lancaster Biotech who looked terrified to even acknowledge me. The remaining seats belonged to people wealthy enough to attend but not important enough to matter. Victoria had organized the room like a chessboard. And she had very deliberately moved me off the board entirely. I unfolded my napkin slowly and glanced toward the front of the ballroom where Graham sat beside Victoria near the stage. He looked comfortable there. Too comfortable. Theodore used to say real leadership should make a person slightly uneasy because too many lives depended on every decision. Graham never carried that weight. He carried entitlement instead. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret whispered quietly once the servers moved away. "I wanted to tell you how sorry I was after Theodore passed." "Thank you," I said gently. "He thought highly of you." Her expression softened. "Your husband saved my late husband's business during the recession. People forget those things." "No. They erased them." There was a difference. Across the ballroom, a massive screen behind the stage displayed old photographs from the Lancaster Foundation over the years. Charity dinners. Hospital donations. Scholarship ceremonies. Theodore appeared in nearly every image shaking hands beside politicians and investors. In half those photographs, I stood beside him just outside the camera center frame. Smiling politely. Supporting quietly. Existing like background decoration in the story of a company I had helped build from a cramped office above a hardware store 31 years ago. Back then Theodore and I worked 18-hour days surviving on takeout coffee and optimism. I handled payroll when we could barely afford employees. I negotiated supplier contracts while Theodore traveled between investors. There were winters when we kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save money for expansion. I still remembered balancing accounting ledgers at our kitchen table while Graham slept upstairs after his mother left the family for California. Theodore trusted me with everything because we built everything together. But after enough years passed and enough money accumulated, people began rewriting success as if it had appeared naturally around the Lancaster name alone. The orchestra quieted suddenly as Victoria stepped onto the stage holding a champagne glass. Conversations lowered immediately. She looked radiant beneath the lights, perfectly poised in silver satin with diamonds glittering against her throat. The audience loved women like Victoria. Beautiful enough to admire. Sharp enough to fear. "Good evening, everyone," she began warmly. "Tonight is about legacy. About honoring the future of Lancaster Biotech and the incredible family that built it." Family. Again that word. Always used like a weapon in that room. Applause filled the ballroom. Victoria smiled graciously before continuing. "As many of you know, growth requires vision. Sometimes it also requires difficult decisions and the courage to let go of outdated attachments." A few people chuckled softly. Her eyes moved briefly toward my table. "The future belongs to leaders willing to evolve." Graham clapped first. Others followed. I remained still, my fingers resting lightly against the stem of my water glass. Margaret glanced at me nervously. "That was unnecessary," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "That was intentional." Victoria continued speaking while the ballroom admired her confidence, but I barely heard the rest. Because in that exact moment, one of the hotel attendants approached my table carrying a small black envelope. "For you, Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly. There was no return name written on it. Just my initials embossed in silver. I opened it carefully beneath the table and felt my pulse slow instead of rise. Inside was a single sentence typed neatly on white cardstock. "The original shareholder agreement is secured. They still do not know." I read the sentence inside the envelope twice before slipping the card quietly back into its place. Around me, the ballroom continued glowing with polished laughter and expensive perfume as if nothing important had happened at all. Victoria remained on stage smiling beneath the lights while donors applauded every carefully rehearsed word that came out of her mouth. But suddenly the entire room felt different to me. Smaller somehow. Fragile beneath all its wealth and confidence. The original shareholder agreement is secured. They still do not know. Theodore's voice echoed faintly in the back of my mind the way it always did whenever business became dangerous. Never underestimate people who mistake silence for weakness, Evelyn. I looked toward the stage again and remembered another ballroom more than 25 years earlier. Back then Lancaster Biotech had not been hosting charity galas at luxury hotels. We were barely surviving. Theodore and I attended a small investor dinner in Milwaukee where nobody remembered our names and the wine tasted like vinegar. Theodore spent half the evening trying to convince skeptical bankers that his research division deserved funding. One man laughed directly in his face. Another suggested selling the company before the debt consumed us. I still remembered Theodore loosening his tie in the hotel room afterward, exhausted and angry. "They think we are finished," he told me. I had opened my inheritance documents right there on the bed and slid them toward him. $280,000 from my father's estate. Nearly everything I had. "Then let them be wrong," I said. Theodore stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head slowly. "If we lose this company, I lose the money. But if you give me this, you will build something worth keeping." He never forgot that conversation. Neither did I. 3 years later Lancaster Biotech exploded into national markets after a breakthrough pharmaceutical contract. Investors called Theodore brilliant. Financial magazines praised his instincts. Reporters wrote stories about the rise of the Lancaster Empire. Nobody mentioned the woman who had quietly kept the company alive long enough for success to arrive. And Theodore let them overlook me because he understood something his family never did. Real power rarely announces itself loudly. A burst of applause pulled me back into the present. Victoria had finished her speech and now Graham stepped onto the stage beside her. Tall. Controlled. Expensive suit perfectly tailored. He looked so much like Theodore from a distance that for one painful second my chest tightened. But Theodore had warmth in his eyes. Graham only had ambition. "Tonight marks a new chapter," Graham announced confidently. "Lancaster Biotech is preparing for unprecedented expansion." More applause followed immediately. Investors loved words like expansion. They never asked who paid the price for it later. Graham continued speaking about innovation, partnerships, and modernization while giant screens displayed projected growth charts behind him. Every sentence sounded polished enough to belong inside a corporate commercial. Yet I noticed Harold Bennett standing near the back wall with his arms folded tightly across his chest. He was not applauding. Neither were several older board members near him. They exchanged brief looks with one another before quickly facing forward again. Tiny cracks. Almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Victoria moved beside Graham gracefully, placing one hand lightly against his arm for the cameras. They looked united. Victorious already. Then Graham said something that made the room shift around me. "My father believed Lancaster Biotech should always remain in family hands." I lowered my eyes slightly to hide my reaction. That was not true. Theodore believed companies belonged to the people capable of protecting them. Blood meant nothing to him if greed replaced integrity. He told me that himself the night he signed the final shareholder amendments 8 years ago in our Connecticut study while snow fell outside the windows. "If anything happens to me," he said quietly while sliding the folder toward me, "promise you will never let them destroy what we built." I remembered laughing softly at the time. "Your family already thinks I control too much." Theodore smiled without humor. "That is because they have no idea how much I actually trust you." Back in the ballroom, Graham raised his champagne glass toward the crowd. "Here is to the future of Lancaster." The guests lifted their glasses with him. Crystals sparkled beneath the chandeliers like hundreds of tiny stars. I lifted mine too. But unlike everyone else in that room, I already knew the future they were celebrating did not belong to them anymore. The dinner plates had been cleared away by the time the ballroom lights dimmed again for the foundation presentation. A giant screen behind the stage shifted from company logos to carefully selected images of smiling children in hospitals and scholarship recipients shaking hands with Lancaster executives. The audience softened immediately. That was the purpose of charity events like these. Wealth always looked kinder when wrapped in philanthropy. I sat quietly near the back of the room while servers refreshed drinks and dessert trays moved between tables. Around me, conversations grew louder and more relaxed now that investors sensed the merger announcement was close. I overheard numbers whispered casually between guests that would have once sounded impossible to me. 40 million. 80 million. Stock conversions. Expansion rights. Human beings reduced to percentages and signatures hidden inside folders. Victoria returned to the stage with graceful confidence, every movement polished for cameras and headlines. Tonight, she announced warmly, the Lancaster Foundation is proud to pledge an additional $20 million toward medical research initiatives across the Midwest. Applause exploded through the ballroom. Several guests even stood briefly in admiration. Victoria lowered her eyes modestly as if generosity came naturally to her. I almost smiled. Theodore used to donate quietly because he believed charity should help people, not advertise ego. Victoria treated generosity like jewelry. Something to wear publicly. Of course, she continued, none of this would be possible without strong leadership guiding Lancaster Biotech into the future. The screen behind her changed again. This time displaying photographs of Graham touring laboratories beside investors from New York. Modern leadership. Visionary expansion. Strategic innovation. Every image carefully designed to erase the company's actual history. Then came the final insult. We also want to honor those who supported Lancaster during earlier chapters, Victoria said sweetly. Even if they are no longer directly involved in the company's future. Several people turned toward my table immediately. Not all at once. Quietly. Carefully. The way people glanced toward an accident without wanting to appear rude. I felt Margaret Ellis tense beside me. Victoria smiled toward the back of the ballroom where I sat hidden near the service doors. Evelyn Whitmore dedicated many years to supporting Theodore during Lancaster's early growth. Supporting Theodore. As if I had simply arranged flowers while men built empires around me. More polite applause followed. Thin applause. Uncomfortable applause. Victoria tilted her head slightly. We are deeply grateful for her contributions and wish her peace as she enjoys retirement from corporate responsibilities. Retirement. I looked down at my folded hands to hide the cold amusement threatening to surface across my face. I had not retired. They had pushed me out after Theodore's funeral under the assumption grief had weakened me enough to surrender quietly. Graham approached the microphone beside Victoria. My father always believed leadership required evolution, he said confidently. Tonight we continue that evolution by preparing Lancaster Biotech for its strongest era yet. Then the ballroom doors near the stage opened unexpectedly. 3 men in dark suits entered carrying briefcases and legal folders. The room shifted almost instantly. Investors straightened in their chairs. Board members exchanged glances. Even Victoria paused for half a second before recovering her smile. I recognized the man walking at the center immediately. Daniel Mercer. Theodore's former corporate attorney. He had retired publicly 2 years earlier after 50 years in business law. Yet there he was walking calmly across the ballroom floor toward Harold Bennett. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. Graham looked confused. Daniel leaned down beside Harold and handed him a thick envelope stamped with silver lettering. Harold opened it slowly while several board members gathered around him. Nobody at my table spoke anymore. The orchestra had stopped entirely now. Only the quiet clink of glassware echoed through the ballroom. Victoria attempted to continue speaking, but her confidence no longer sounded effortless. As I was saying, she began carefully, the future of Lancaster. Harold stood abruptly. "Excuse me," he interrupted loudly enough for the microphone to catch his voice across the room. Every conversation died instantly. Harold adjusted his glasses and looked directly toward the stage. Then he turned slowly toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with unmistakable respect, "it appears there are several matters regarding controlling shareholder authority that this board was never informed about." The silence that followed Harold Bennett's words spread through the ballroom like a crack moving across glass. Nobody reached for their champagne anymore. Nobody smiled for the cameras. Victoria stood frozen beside the podium, one manicured hand still wrapped around the microphone while Graham stared at Harold with open confusion. For the first time all evening, the carefully controlled atmosphere inside the Whitmore Grand Hotel began slipping beyond their control. Daniel Mercer remained near the front row, calm and expressionless, as several board members gathered around the documents he had delivered. I could see the shift happening in real time. Eyes narrowing. Pages turning faster. Quiet whispers beginning between executives who suddenly realized tonight was not unfolding according to the script they had been promised. Victoria recovered first, though barely. "Harold," she said with a strained laugh, "perhaps this is not the appropriate time for legal housekeeping." A few uncertain chuckles echoed through the room before fading quickly. Harold did not smile. "This is not housekeeping," he replied evenly. "This concerns controlling ownership authority over Lancaster Biotech." Every word landed harder than the last. Graham stepped away from the podium now, his confident posture tightening. "What exactly are you talking about?" Daniel Mercer answered before Harold could. 8 years ago Theodore Lancaster amended the original shareholder structure under private legal authority. Graham blinked slowly. "That is impossible. I reviewed every corporate transition document after my father passed." Daniel adjusted his cuff calmly. "You reviewed the documents your father allowed you to review." A low murmur spread across the ballroom. Victoria's expression sharpened immediately. "This is absurd," she snapped. "If there were additional controlling shares, the board would have known." "Not necessarily," Daniel replied. "The amended structure was placed under protected deferred disclosure until activation conditions were met." I remained seated quietly while the room slowly turned toward me one face at a time. Earlier that evening they had looked at me with polite dismissal. Now they looked uncertain. Curious. Careful. It amazed me how quickly respect returned once money became involved. Graham walked down from the stage toward Harold and Daniel, his jaw tense enough that I could see the muscles shifting beneath the ballroom lights. "You are telling me my father transferred controlling authority without informing his own family?" Daniel held his gaze evenly. "Your father informed the individual he trusted most." Graham finally looked toward me directly. Really looked at me for the first time all evening. Not as Theodore's widow. Not as a retired inconvenience seated near the service doors. But as someone standing between him and the future he thought already belonged to him. Victoria descended from the stage more slowly, her silver gown catching the chandelier light with every step. "Evelyn," she said carefully, forcing calm into her voice, "if there has been some misunderstanding, surely we can discuss this privately." There it was. The change in tone. 3 hours earlier she had introduced me as a courtesy guest. Now suddenly she wanted private conversations. I folded my hands gently in my lap. I was under the impression I was no longer directly involved in the company's future. Several people nearby lowered their eyes immediately. Victoria's face tightened for only a second before her polished smile returned. "You know that is not what I meant." "No," I said softly. "I know exactly what you meant." The ballroom had become painfully quiet now. Even the hotel staff moved more carefully as if afraid to interrupt something historic unfolding in front of them. Graham turned back toward Daniel. "How many shares are we talking about?" Daniel opened the folder slowly. "Enough to suspend merger authorization immediately pending executive review." The words hit the room harder than any shouted accusation could have. One investor near the front cursed quietly under his breath. Another reached for his phone at once. Across the ballroom, board members began speaking rapidly to one another while several donors looked visibly uncomfortable. The merger. The expansion. The future Victoria and Graham had spent months celebrating in private meetings and magazine interviews. Suddenly none of it looked guaranteed anymore. Harold removed his glasses slowly and looked directly at me with unmistakable respect. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "under the amended shareholder structure, final executive authority now rests entirely with you." No one applauded after Harold Bennett finished speaking. The ballroom remained suspended in a silence so heavy it almost felt physical. A few minutes earlier the room had belonged entirely to Graham and Victoria. Investors had admired them. Donors had toasted them. Cameras had followed them like royalty. Now every eye kept drifting back toward me instead. I sat quietly at the back table beside the orchids exactly where Victoria had placed me, yet suddenly the distance between us no longer mattered. Power changes the atmosphere around people long before anyone speaks about it aloud. Graham looked like he was struggling to keep his breathing. "Steady. This cannot happen without board approval," he said sharply. Daniel Mercer closed the folder in his hands with deliberate calm. "According to the amended structure, Mrs. Whitmore possesses emergency executive authority tied directly to Theodore Lancaster's founding shares." Victoria folded her arms tightly across her waist. "Emergency authority for what exactly?" Daniel looked toward her without emotion. "For preventing actions that threaten the long-term stability of the company." A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances immediately. Everyone understood what that meant. The merger. Theodore had never wanted outside control over Lancaster Biotech. He believed private equity firms gutted companies slowly until only the profits remained. Graham had spent the last year moving toward the exact future Theodore feared most. "This is unbelievable," Victoria said quietly, though the panic beneath her polished tone had started showing now. Theodore would never cut his own family out of leadership. I finally stood from my seat then. Slowly. Calmly. Every movement felt strangely quiet beneath the chandeliers. "He did not cut his family out," I said softly. "He protected his company from people he no longer trusted to lead it." The words landed harder than I intended. Graham stared at me as if seeing a stranger standing in front of him. "You knew about this the entire time?" he asked. I held his gaze steadily. "Your father informed me 8 years ago. And you said nothing after he died?" There it was again. Not grief for Theodore. Not shock over betrayal. Just anger that he had not been given control automatically. "You never asked," I replied. Graham looked away first. Across the ballroom, several investors had already stepped aside to make urgent phone calls. One man near the stage was typing rapidly into his tablet while another executive whispered nervously to a woman from the merger firm. The energy inside the room had completely changed now. Earlier the gala felt glamorous. Now it felt dangerous. Victoria approached me carefully, lowering her voice enough that nearby guests had to pretend not to listen. "Evelyn, whatever Theodore signed can still be handled privately. There is no reason to embarrass the family in front of everyone." I almost laughed at that. Embarrass the family. As if she had not spent the entire evening publicly reducing me to a decorative widow seated beside the service doors. "You were not concerned about privacy earlier tonight," I said calmly. Color rose slightly into her cheeks. "I was trying to move the company forward." "No," I replied. "You were trying to erase anyone who reminded people where the company actually came from." For a moment Victoria looked genuinely angry enough to stop pretending. "You think sentiment builds corporations?" she whispered sharply. "Theodore is gone. Times change. Integrity should not." Her expression hardened immediately. "You are willing to destroy Graham's future over personal resentment?" That question finally hurt. Not because of Victoria. Because of Graham himself. I looked toward him standing near the stage under Theodore's portrait while executives and board members circled around him in tense conversation. I remembered helping him with college applications. I remembered Theodore teaching him how to drive at our Connecticut lake house. I remembered the night Graham cried after his first major business failure and Theodore told him mistakes mattered less than character. Somewhere along the way Graham stopped caring about character. And maybe Theodore had seen that long before I did. This was never about resentment, I said quietly. It was about responsibility. Harold Bennett approached us once more carrying the legal documents. Mrs. Whitmore, he said respectfully, the board is requesting an immediate private meeting upstairs before any merger announcement proceeds further. Victoria's face went pale instantly. Because she understood what the rest of the ballroom was only beginning to realize. The future she had spent all evening celebrating no longer belonged to her. The executive conference room on the 32nd floor overlooked the Chicago skyline through walls of dark glass and rain-speckled windows. By the time I entered beside Harold Bennett and Daniel Mercer, every board member was already seated around the long walnut table except Graham and Victoria, who arrived moments later carrying the tension of the ballroom upstairs with them. Nobody offered casual conversation anymore. The atmosphere inside that room felt stripped clean of performance. No champagne. No orchestra. No charity speeches. Just money, power, and the quiet fear that comes when wealthy people realize they may have miscalculated something important. Theodore used to say boardrooms revealed who people truly were because eventually every polished mask cracked under pressure. Tonight he would have been proven right again. I took the seat at the far end of the table beneath the framed photograph of Lancaster Biotech's original headquarters. A tiny brick building above a hardware store in Milwaukee. Looking at it tightened my throat unexpectedly. We built an empire from that little office while eating frozen dinners at midnight and sleeping 4 hours a night. Back then none of us cared about gala seating arrangements or magazine interviews. We only cared about survival. Harold adjusted several legal documents in front of him before speaking carefully. As of 6:42 this evening, activation conditions tied to Theodore Lancaster's deferred shareholder protections were officially met. Graham leaned forward sharply. What conditions? Daniel answered calmly. Attempted transfer of executive control through merger authorization without approval from the protected majority shareholder. Graham stared at him in disbelief. You are saying my father anticipated this? Daniel met his eyes evenly. Your father anticipated many things. Victoria finally lost patience. This entire arrangement is insane, she snapped. Theodore died over a year ago. Companies cannot be controlled by secret emotional agreements from the past. Emotional. Interesting word choice. Women's authority was always called emotional when powerful men disliked the outcome. I folded my hands quietly on the table. Nothing about Theodore's contracts was emotional. Several older board members nodded slightly at that. Victoria noticed it too. Evelyn, she said tightly, surely you understand what happens if the merger collapses now. Investors will panic. The media will destroy the company. The media did not build this company, I replied softly. And investors do not own its values. Graham exhaled slowly through his nose before turning toward me directly. What exactly do you want? There it was. Not an apology. Not regret for how they treated me. Just negotiation now that the balance of power had shifted. I studied him for a long moment before answering. I want the merger suspended immediately. Victoria shook her head at once. Impossible. Harold interrupted quietly. Actually, under the amended structure, Mrs. Whitmore has full authority to suspend executive actions pending board review. Silence followed again. Graham rubbed one hand across his jaw, exhaustion finally beginning to show beneath his polished appearance. For the first time all evening he looked less like Theodore's confident air and more like a frightened man realizing his father never fully trusted him. Why would he do this? He asked quietly. The question sounded almost personal now. Almost wounded. I looked toward the rain sliding slowly down the windows behind him. Because Theodore believed character mattered more than ambition. Graham lowered his eyes immediately. Victoria stood from her chair abruptly and walked toward the windows. "This is unbelievable," she muttered. "After everything we have done for this company." I almost answered her. Then stopped myself. People like Victoria always confused visibility with value. She believed appearances created power because appearances had always worked for her before. Theodore understood something different. The people who quietly protect a company through its weakest years often matter more than the people standing center stage during its strongest ones. Harold slid a final document across the table toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "if you wish to proceed, your signature will formally suspend all merger activity effective immediately." Every person in the room watched me then. Graham. Victoria. The board members. The attorneys. 31 years of loyalty and sacrifice reduced to a single line waiting for my name. I picked up the pen slowly. Theodore used to joke that the quietest moments in business were often the most expensive ones. Tonight, I finally understood exactly what he meant. I signed the document without rushing. The sound of the pen moving across paper seemed strangely loud inside the silent conference room. When I finished, Harold Bennett collected the papers carefully while Daniel Mercer closed his briefcase with the calm precision of a man who had just completed something inevitable. Across the table, Graham stared down at the polished walnut surface as though he no longer recognized the future sitting in front of him. Victoria remained near the windows with her arms folded tightly, the reflection of Chicago's skyline glowing faintly against the glass behind her. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain of her own influence. Harold cleared his throat gently. "Effective immediately, all merger negotiations are suspended pending executive restructuring and board review." The words settled heavily over the room. Decades of ambition. Months of secret negotiations. Millions of dollars balanced on expectations that no longer existed. Nobody argued this time. Even Victoria understood the fight had shifted beyond charm and performance now. Graham finally looked toward me again. "So what happens next?" His voice sounded tired instead of angry. Older somehow. I thought about Theodore then. About the countless nights he sat awake in our Connecticut studying contracts long after midnight because he believed leadership meant protecting people who trusted you. He used to say power revealed character faster than hardship ever could. Hardship makes people survive. Power gives them choices. "That depends on whether Lancaster Biotech remembers what it was built to do," I said quietly. Nobody responded immediately. Because deep down they all knew the company had stopped being about innovation years ago. Somewhere along the way it became about appearances. Stock prices. Magazine covers. Social status. Theodore would have hated what it was becoming. The board meeting ended just after midnight. By then the ballroom downstairs had mostly emptied. Investors left early after hearing rumors spread through the hotel corridors. Donors avoided eye contact on their way out. The orchestra had packed away their instruments hours earlier. As I walked slowly through the now quiet lobby toward the front entrance, I noticed workers dismantling flower arrangements beneath the chandeliers while hotel staff cleared abandoned champagne glasses from marble tables. The glamour always disappeared faster than people expected. "Evelyn." I turned near the revolving doors and found Graham standing several feet behind me with his hands in his coat pockets. Without the stage lights and cameras around him, he suddenly looked much younger. Almost like the boy Theodore used to coach through baseball practice on cold Saturday mornings. "I did love him," Graham said quietly. "I know," I answered. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I thought I was doing what the company needed." "No," I said softly. "You were doing what impressed the wrong people." The honesty of it hurt him. I could see that immediately. But sometimes truth sounds cruel simply because it arrives too late. Snow had started falling outside while we stood there beneath the hotel lights. Slow. Quiet. Chicago looked softer at night when winter covered everything sharp. Graham glanced toward the street before speaking again. "Are you going to force me out?" Such a strange question after everything that had happened. Theodore never wanted revenge. Neither did I. That depends on what kind of man you decide to become after tonight, I said. He lowered his eyes without answering. I stepped outside into the cold air before he could say anything else. My driver opened the car door, but I paused for a moment beside the curb looking back at the towering hotel windows glowing against the snow. Earlier that evening I arrived there as a woman they believed no longer mattered. A courtesy guest seated near the service doors. An aging widow they expected to disappear quietly while they inherited the future. Instead, Theodore's portrait still hung above that ballroom tonight, watching over a company neither greed nor arrogance had managed to steal from him completely. I slipped into the back seat and closed the door gently behind me. As the car pulled away from the hotel, my phone vibrated once with a new message from Harold Bennett. The board has unanimously requested your return as executive chairwoman effective tomorrow morning. I looked out the window at the falling snow and allowed myself the smallest smile of the entire night. Not because I had one, but because after 14 months of silence, Theodore's company finally remembered who had protected it all along.